Hi, and welcome to this edition of Baking at Bacon, the home quarantine edition. And today we're going to be talking about yeast, and more specifically, sourdough. A packet of yeast makes dinner rolls rise, but some of us may not have yeast at home, and I've heard that a lot of people are having difficulty finding it in stores right now. I was lucky enough to purchase a pound of it around the holidays, so I'm good for a while. But if you don't have it, what are you going to do in order to make some yeast bread? So we are going to create a sourdough starter. Well, what is sourdough? Sourdough bread and starters have been around for thousands of years, but the term itself has a relatively short history. It is a U.S. term that came around during the California Gold Rush in the late 1800s. Miners would stop into San Francisco to pick up necessary supplies before they would head into the mountains. And one of these necessary supplies would include a bread starter. And when they decided to start making bread out of this starter, they found that it had a tanginess and a sourness. And so breads from this area started to be known as sourdough. But you don't have to live in San Francisco to create your own sourdough starter. Sourdough starters act the same as purchased yeast. But how? Well, wild yeast is in the air all around us. It settles on your kitchen work surfaces and even in your ingredients like flour. When flour is mixed with liquid, the friendly bacteria lactobacilli and the wild yeast in both your environment and your flour start working together to produce gas. I like to think of yeast as little creatures that are going and eating the sugars and starches and start burping out carbon dioxide. These air bubbles are then trapped by gluten within the dough and are ultimately what make your sourdough bread rise. Sourdough bread's signature taste actually comes from that friendly bacteria and yeast, which starts to produce flavorful acids within the dough. So, back to gluten. What is it? I know a lot of us have heard the term before with some people who have a gluten allergy. Well, gluten is the protein found in flour. Some flours have less, like cake flour, and some flours have more, like bread flour. Once you start to mix a liquid in with the flour, you start to develop this gluten, and it starts to form these long, squiggly strands. Some things you would like to have less gluten, because for something like a quick bread, the more that you stir it and the more that you develop the gluten, you're going to end up with a tough product. However, with something like yeast bread, we need gluten, because gluten starts to, as we knead the dough, sort of form this web. And it almost acts like a balloon. So as our yeast keeps burping out that carbon dioxide, our gluten web starts to trap it, and like a balloon, it starts to rise, and that's what expands our bread dough. So what supplies are you going to need in order to start collecting this wild yeast and create your own sourdough starter? You're going to need some flour. The recipe recommends using a whole wheat flour. Whole grains just tend to have more nutrients and more microorganisms that help feed your sourdough. But I know a lot of us don't have whole wheat flours at home. So I'm actually going to try making it with King Arthur flour all-purpose. And this is actually an unbleached flour, and I highly recommend that you use an unbleached flour if at all possible. I'm also going to make one using white whole wheat flour that I happen to have here, and that way I can compare the results of the two and see if it really makes a difference. You're also going to need some sort of quart size container. That means that it can hold 4 cups of water. So I have a couple of mason jars that are quart size, but if you don't, start looking around to see what you have that would be a food safe container. It can be plastic, it can be glass, it can be ceramic, you can use a Tupperware, a pitcher, whatever you have, but you really need to make sure that you have something that is quart size or larger. You're also going to need some water, and you can basically just use your tap water. The only times that you would want to use bottled water would be that if you can smell your tap water and it smells like chemicals, it may have too much chlorine in it, which could affect your starter. The other thing is, if you begin your starter and after a couple days you notice that it starts to have mold on it, It may be something with the chlorine in your water, so go ahead and switch to a bottled water. With our temperature of water, we want it to be about room temperature between 68 and 70. If your house tends to be hotter than that, you may want to use a cooler size of water, or if your house is cool, maybe you'd use slightly warmer. You don't really want to go much higher than your body temperature. So if you stick your finger in and it feels about the same, you're probably good to go. If you microwaved water and you added it in with 138 degrees or higher, you're actually going to kill the yeast. So make sure that you don't do that. And then what we're going to do is we need about 1 cup of flour. They call it for a scant cup. Now, anytime you see scant cup or scant half cup in a recipe, basically it means a little under versus a generous or heaping cup would be a little over. I highly recommend, if you have a scale, that you'll want to go ahead and weigh everything. So your scant 1 cup of flour would be 4 ounces. And then we're also going to use a half a cup of water, which is also 4 ounces. I happen to have one of these scales here. It is about $20, $25 on Amazon. So as you start to get a little bit more into baking, it might be something that you would like to invest in. When you are measuring your flour without a scale, how you do it is actually really important, and this goes for all recipes. You don't want to just dip your cup in and compact the flour in your cup. So many recipes are actually ruined because people don't measure their flour properly. So what you need to do is get some sort of spoon, and you want to reach in and just fluff up your flour. Then, using that same spoon, you're going to just lightly put the flour into your cup. Now, generally, I would do this over a bowl so I don't make too much of a mess. Okay, and again, we're looking for a scant cup. So normally, if you would want a level cup, you would use the back of a knife or something straight in order to level this off. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just to see kind of where we're at. This is actually pretty much a level cup of flour right now. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on my scale just to see where I'm at with this. Okay, and right now it's saying 6.3 ounces, which I know my cup itself weighs 1.8 ounces. So I'm looking for something 5.3. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a little bit out. And a little more. And then I can show you maybe what it looks like. Okay. All right, so you can see it's actually quite a bit under the 1 cup. Okay, so if you go too much, is it going to really kill it? No, it's not. Okay, but just know you definitely don't want anything heaping, and you don't want to compact your flour in the cup because that will affect it. So I'm going to go ahead and, as carefully as I can here, put this into my jar. So now that I have these in, I need to go ahead and get my water. Now I went and got my water. I've already added it into my white whole wheat. And when you are getting water, if you don't have a liquid measuring cup at home, yes, it's okay to use a dry measuring cup. But the reason you always want to use a liquid measuring cup is for a couple different reasons. The first is it makes it a lot easier to pour, and because of the extra space here, you know that if you're transporting it from one place to another, you're not going to drop a bunch out. The other reason is for our liquid measuring cup, you want to be able to get down to eye level and be able to measure exactly where half a cup is. Okay, so when you're looking at a liquid in a measuring cup, kind of has this curve, and you want the bottom of the curve to hit exactly on the line that you're looking for. So I already have my half cup of water in here, and I'm going to head and add it to my all-purpose flour. You can use whatever you'd like to stir. I'm just going to use my whisk. Okay, now that I have mixed all the flour in, what's nice about using some sort of glass or see-through container is you can really look at the bottom to see, do you see any of that dry flour left? And if so, go ahead and mix it a little bit more. Now you want to cover the container loosely and let the mixture sit at a warm room temperature for 24 hours. So with these, you'll note that I'm just going to go ahead and put the tops on, but I'm not going to put a band on and tighten this up. If I was using something like a Tupperware container, you could put the top back on it, but not press it down. The reason being is because we want to be able to let some of the carbon dioxide out. We want to be able to let some of the additional yeast in. So really just make sure that it's not a tight-fitting container. You could also just put a plate up on top. You don't want to go ahead and use something like a dish towel. The reason being is that your starter will actually start to dry out from that. Now the other place is, where are you going to put it? You really need a relatively warm place for your starter to sit. If it's a nice day, you could definitely put it in a sunny window. Of course, unfortunately today it's cold and rainy outside. You could put it near a baseboard heater. You could set it on top of your refrigerator or any other type of appliance that kind of lets out an ambient heat. Or you can also set the container of starter on top of a heating pad at its lowest setting and just put like a folded dish towel underneath so that it doesn't get too hot. And in fact, I think this is what I'm going to do today because, as I mentioned, it's not sunny outside. Then we're going to come back in 24 hours to begin day 2 of feeding our starter and keeping it going. This is not a one-day process. It almost becomes like a pet where you have to feed it up to 2 times a day before it really gets going. How fast it gets going will really depend on the yeast that is around, the type of flour and water that you use, and the ambient temperature. So tune into day 2 of the starter to learn how to feed your starter and keep it going.